best training split for beginners? I think we firstly need to define, when we say training split, I think let's talk about resistance training here.
Okay, so just resistance.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to go back to, I know all we're doing is going back to principles.
Yes.
Right. So when we talked about strength, we're talking about the continuum. When we talked about aerobic, we're talking about a framework, and we're talking about that continuum. So when we're talking about a beginner, well, first we've got to figure out what is a beginner. So what would you classify as a beginner in resistance training?
Well, I would say technically the terms like novice or beginner really refers to anyone who's done like 0 to 3, sometimes even up to 5 years of resistance training. But I would generally say in this case, let's say this is someone who hasn't really done any resistance training before. So stepping into the gym or working with a coach for the very first time. I think one assumption we can definitely make is that the training frequency for a beginner, so the amount of sessions they do in a week, is going to be lower than someone who's an intermediate or advanced. So I think for safety's sake, for argument's sake, I should say, let's say this individual is training 2 to 3 times per week.
Well, I think so now we've got to understand if that's a beginner, right? So going back to that strength continuum we talked about, what's the first step of that strength continuum? Well, it's motor control, right? So in order to get motor control, what does that individual need? That individual needs multiple touches across multiple different patterns or multiple different muscle groups, whatever way you want to program, right? So in terms of, say, they're training 3 times a week, we want to be doing a split that's called full body resistance, or FBR. Reason that they're doing full body resistance is going back to, like we just said, they need multiple touches of the same movement in order to see progress, and in order to actually just learn that movement, in order to gain that motor control, they need multiple touches throughout the week. And that's why we would give them full body resistance.
Yes, I think it's really important to define what do we mean by motor control. It's essentially teaching someone the skill of doing a movement. And we know when you're acquiring a new skill the first time, let's say it's a dumbbell press, you've never trained before, you see what happens when you put 2 dumbbells in someone's hands. Those dumbbells are wobbling,
all over the place, right?
Wobbling everywhere, losing control of dumbbells. And the focus, what that individual is experiencing, is not really strength adaptations. It's just trying to learn how to control the damn dumbbells. And what we're saying, what you're saying here is that we need to give this individual more constant touches if we're going to develop that skill. Now, we know with any skill, if you only do that thing once a week, so once every 6-7 days, then your rate of adaptation or your rate of learning is going to be slower versus the person who's doing that once every 3 days or once every 4 days. So that's what we're saying here, is that in those early stages of learning, we need to be doing less variety. We need to be getting more touches of the same movements until we've developed the motor control, the skill aspect. And then we can start to explore more. So what you're saying by FBR, Liam, we're essentially saying full body resistance. That means in a training session, we are doing some legs and we're doing some upper body, or we're doing pushing, pulling, we're doing hinging, squatting, we're doing lunging, split squatting, whatever you want to, however you're constructing your training program, but we're doing bits of everything. So we're giving that individual more frequent touches. I think another thing to just understand there for people listening is that when you are a beginner, we are able to create less of a neurological response from training because we haven't done enough of the movement yet. So, a heavy set for a beginner feels very different to a heavy set for an advanced athlete. A heavy set for an advanced person is going to really take a lot of resources out of them. It's going to mean the recovery process is going to be a little bit longer versus a beginner haven't developed the skill yet, haven't developed the neurological inroads exactly to be able actually to express a really heavy rep. So they'll be able to finish a heavy set and a minute later be totally fine and ready to do it again.
And I think we use the analogy all the time of the light bulb, right? Like that individual that's coming, and you give the example of the bench press, like they need to be doing higher reps. Like you can't be giving that beginner like 3 reps, because essentially it's only getting 2 reps of that movement. They can't express intensity, or they don't have that motor control to express that intensity. So it's important to also remember when we are working with beginners, well, what else do we need? We need full body resistance, but we also need higher tempo, right? Because we're trying to really control that movement, but we also need higher rep ranges. So there we're maybe thinking of like that 10, maybe even up to like 15 reps in order to get some sort of dose response.